This past week in the Minnesota House, issues related to girls' sports took front and center. Let's start with last Tuesday when House Democrats blocked from passage the Preserving Girls Sports Act, HF 12, even though polls show around 80% of people agree with the bill's position. By doing so, Democrats put female athletics at risk by undermining safe and fair competition for girls in school-sanctioned athletics. Then there was last Thursday when the House Judiciary Committee conducted a hearing for a House Republican bill, HF 1342, exempting women's athletics from the Human Rights Act anti-discrimination provisions regarding gender identity. Why is that necessary? Well, let's back up. Sex has been a protected class in the Minnesota Human Rights Act since 1967. The purpose of protecting biological sex from discrimination was to ensure that members of the female sex could access the same rights, privileges, and opportunities as members of the male sex. That's why we have Title IX. For over 50 years, the law remained silent on this novel concept of gender identity. Never throughout the history of anti-discrimination law have we ever had to protect classes that directly contradicted each other until we introduced gender identity as defined by those who came up with it and continue to promote it today. It was not until 2024, just last year, that this legislature and a Democrat trifecta chose to introduce gender identity as a protected class under the Human Rights Act, making this bill necessary. The legislative action was, in effect, a confession that biological sex and gender identity are not the same thing. Otherwise, why would a separate classification be necessary? The problem is that adding anti-discrimination protections for gender identity created a direct conflict with the long-standing protection for biological sex. Here's the thing. Gender identity is a category that has nothing whatsoever to do with the biological distinction of sex. And that contributes to all these arguments we've been hearing this week. People on both sides of the aisle use terms like men, women, boys, and girls, but we're talking past each other because we're not actually talking about the same thing. To be sure, we're using the same words, but we're definitely not talking about the same thing. And that's because when we talk about it as Republicans, we're referring to the distinction between the female sex and the male sex. And when Democrats are talking about it, they're referring to an arbitrary, subjective distinction of gender identity and expression. Those two categories obviously do not align and, in fact, directly conflict with each other. If we provide anti-discrimination protections for sex, the male sex or the female sex, but also say you can't discriminate against somebody for their gender identity and expression, an inherent and inevitable conflict is constructed. Somebody who wants to discriminate against the female sex can do so simply by claiming to be female, even though they're not. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen in women's athletics. Now, I'm not naive enough to expect that we will all come to a shared agreement on this proposed policy, but I do hope that we can at least agree on the underlying facts, on the basic, indisputable reality that justifies this bill. Are we going to protect the female sex from discrimination in women's athletics or not? Those are the only two binary choices, and it is indeed a binary choice. I choose to stand with the female sex rather than the arbitrary claims of somebody who's expressing themselves. Thank you, Representative Zalesnikar, for authoring HF 1342, and Representative Scott for authoring HF 12 to protect the female sex in women's athletics. The Public Safety, Finance, and Policy Committee conducted hearings for 3 separate bills I have authored this session. Here's a snapshot. HF 767 increases penalties for politically motivated arson. This is in response to 3 separate conservative offices being targeted by arsonists last year, but rightfully applies to any political arson attack. HF 764 removes the statute of limitations for arson. Statutes of limitations aim to protect defendants from being charged on faulty evidence. That said, prosecution of the most serious crimes may be warranted regardless of how much time has passed. This should include arson. HF 765 increases the penalties for offenders who commit 3 violent crimes. Homicides and carjackings are up around the Twin Cities, with soft-on-crime policies contributing to some extent. We need to hold repeat offenders accountable for their actions, and this bill is a step toward getting chronic offenders off the streets. The hearings went well for each bill, and they remain viable for passage. A new economic forecast from Minnesota Management and Budget was issued on Thursday and reveals there is a $456 million projected balance for 2026 and 27, which is down $160 million from previous estimates. The projected general fund shortfall for the 2028-29 biennium is now $6 billion. That's $852 million worse than the November estimates and nearly a state record deficit. State spending growth outpaces revenue growth through projections going through 2029. And this is what the Democrats' reckless spending and unnecessary tax increases get you. They shouldn't have gone on a spending spree. You didn't need to be Nostradamus to see this coming. All you needed was a grasp of basic math and an understanding that blowing a historic surplus to increase the state budget by 40% isn't going to add up on the bottom line. Good thing House Republicans broke up the Democrats' stranglehold they had on Minnesotans and our state government the last 2 years so we can get our state back on track. Take care.